Welcome, everybody, to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, soon to be the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Affairs, presentation of our weekly, bi-weekly war room. My name is Irwin Mansdorf. I'm a senior fellow at the center working in political psychology. I'm substituting for Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch, who's wasn't able to make it today. We're pleased to have Tirza Shorr, who's one of our senior researchers here on a very timely paper that was published on the center's website, which I would urge you to take a look at if you haven't seen it yet, and read it after the broadcast. It's on what we call the Red-Green Alliance, and we're going to have a little discussion on it. And we hope this is going to be able to open up some understanding of the strange situation that we see not only in the United States, but around the world, of an alliance between what we would normally expect to be people that have completely different value systems. On the one hand, you have Islamists that are very conservative, very religious, against all kinds of things that fall into the basket of human rights. On the other hand, we have people that call themselves progressive, that are against all kinds of things that the religious right stands for. They're aligned together in this mission, not only against Israel, but against the West, against the United States, and something that we hope to get into and explore a little bit. So Tirza, thank you for that wonderful paper. That is something that is a result of a long time coming in terms of the research and seeing what it is. But one of the things that you mentioned right at the beginning of the paper that I was hoping you'd be able to give some of our viewers an understanding of is the letter to America that Osama bin Laden wrote.
Right. Attributed to him.
Attributed to him,
right.
But that's good enough because that's what right. people think it is. And the fact that even though people attribute the letter to Osama bin Laden, it got the reaction that it got.
Right.
And that's something that I was wondering if you could give us a little background on the letter.
The letter he wrote, I mean, I can't quote it verbatim, but basically he criticizes the West and he appeals to the young people of the West to see that the West is not, what it makes itself out to be. And that was just a takeoff point for what I wrote, because the entire idea of the Red-Green Alliance, again, we'll go through. The red is the communists and the leftists, and the green meaning the Islamists. That's been around for decades. And even further than Osama bin Laden's letters, which was 2002, we go back all the way to the Islamist revolution in Iran in 1979. So that's really where you had actual participation. That just wasn't a bunch of protests and encampments. It was people actually coming together for a revolution against the Shah of Iran. And that actually had significant consequences that we're feeling today. They would like to encourage that whole configuration all over again to create, more.
One of the things that was in the press in the United States was that a lot of young people,
young people were turned on by this whole by this Osama bin Laden.
Anyone that was around during 9/11 and remembers Osama bin Laden was the devil incarnate at the time. And how does somebody like that, who was totally the picture of evil for Americans in terms of how many Americans he was responsible for murdering, becomes a sort of like Che Guevara-like folk hero for young people today?
Okay, so how did that happen? So that's a good question. So that was in 2002, and I don't think the Western youth was not, enthralled with the letter at the time. So within the past 20 years or so, there has been just, I would say, an exponential growth of the post-colonialist narrative in colleges, in the general public. It's not only post-colonial. Again, we'll go backtrack a little bit. What is that? We're talking about a school of thought that comes out of neo-Marxism. It's influenced by postmodernism, and that entire neo-Marxist and postmodernist kind of.
So let's understand what postmodernism is. I think a lot of people don't understand what that means.
And there's a difference between the two also. So neo-Marxism is after the fall of this, or actually after Stalinism was exposed in the Soviet Union. people started becoming critical of classical Marxism. Also, classical Marxism became less relevant because people were succeeding in the West. Advanced capitalism had brought prosperity to the West, to the United States and to Western Europe. So therefore, the entire critique that had come from, 75 years before, from the 1840s, if we're going into the early 20th century, if it, Marx was writing in the mid 19th century, his critique was on the Industrial Revolution and how people were being exploited in factories and their fingers are being cut off in machines and they had to work, 20 hours a day or whatever. So that was his critique. And then when capitalism actually succeeded in building prosperity and there were reforms in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s, people started living a good life, especially after World War II, where you had baby boomers, you had the entire generation post-war, and America was doing well. And now the neo-Marxists from the 60s and 70s had to think how to reinvent the revolution, because obviously it became almost a spiritual kind of.
So we talking people like Angela Davis?
Well, Angela Davis was, she was actually aligned with the Soviet Union, so she in a way was very much like a classic Marxist.
And Marcuse?
Marcuse was something else. She was his student. This was like the next step. This is where you get from the old Marxism, which now the postmodernist people call it vulgar Marxism, which is just about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and how they control the economy. But it's now gone into, that is not revolutionary enough. That did not complete the communist revolution, world revolution. So what are we going to do now? And what Marcuse said, and we're living kind of in Marcuse's world, is we'll take the academics and we'll take the ghetto, he called it the ghetto population, which is the poor people in the inner city, and we'll put them together and we'll create a revolution out of them. That'll be the revolutionary engine. We'll teach them, and his critique was very much of the materialistic success of advanced capitalism, that people were living in false consciousnness.
But there was violence involved in that, in the thinking. This with Angela Davis.
Angela Davis. So this is where Marcuse kind of merges with Frantz Fanon, which is, we'll see from here, from the post. That's where the post-colonialism comes in, because Frantz Fanon was from Martinique, and of course Martinique was a colonized island of France, and he was obviously the descendant of slaves that had been brought there. And he himself talked about the identity of being a Black person, but having to kind of bow to the French culture. And eventually he was a psychiatrist, as a well-educated person. He went to Algeria to be in the FLN, to be a revolutionary in Algeria. And he was not the only one. He was a good friend of Sartre, who wrote the introduction to his book Wretched of the Earth. And his takeaway from his book, you could say, was that violence would free someone's psychology. He was a psychiatrist, so he, obviously psychology is involved in that, and that the violence that would be perpetrated by the colonized would free them, would free their spirit, and would allow them to have catharsis and allow them to regain their self-respect. Now take that and you insert that into the PLO, insert that into Yasser Arafat, insert that into terrorism. And that idea was distributed in the Middle East through Beirut. Beirut was Paris of the Middle East, so they were reading this in French. And Fayez Saig, who was the head of the Palestine Research Center, which was the propaganda arm of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Palestine Liberation Organization, they produced booklets that were based on these kind of ideas of Frantz Fanon. That Zionism was colonialism. And that was in the mid-60s. It was together with Marcuse. This is all happening at the same time.
But how do we segue all this into the religious element? Now, we all understand the nationalistic element, the
religious element of Islam,
the ideology we see of Islam. That was able to incorporate. Now, was it a real incorporation, or is it just any means necessary, I'm going to use you right now incorporation?
There's two different parts. There's two different parts. First of all, in the Islamic Revolution, there were people who were Islamic Marxists, meaning that they felt, and this is the MEK, this is some of the biggest, not only MEK, there were actually about 3 or 4 different Islamic Marxist groups, but they were the most famous of them, that they believed that Islam in itself had social justice elements in it. And that could be connected with Marxism. So that could be, you know, those two things could work together well. Of course, it wouldn't take all the other things that Marxism was pushing at the time. It wouldn't take the sexual revolution of Marcuse, for example, but it could take on things like, you know, everybody having trade unions, which was one of the biggest issues for the Iranians at the time. And they took those workers' rights and those kinds of ideas, and the idea of zakat, of giving you know, alms to the poor. These were things that could be incorporated, and there were a lot of these kind of hybrid Marxist you know, movements at the time. Not only between the Marxists, also there was Arab socialism, which is something that Nasser pushed. Then there was this whole thing. So there is, I mean, there is also in Judaism, we also have people that claim to be that socialism was in line with this whole tikkun olam idea, is very much a socialism, liberation theology for the Catholics in South America. These two things can combine together because we want to do good for society. The question is, how does it want to do good for society? And it really is more Marxism with something else, you know, dressed on top of it as, you know, the religious clothing, but in its core, it's a
The question is,
Marxist.
why did this die with the fall of the Soviet Union, when communism and Marxism included as part of that really became,
Because it
became
kind
on
of,
the out? It
it
wasn't,
didn't,
it wasn't
didn't
popular
die
anymore.
because the academics that this is already, I mean, your generation is a baby boomer generation, mine is Gen X. It was already, your generation was already getting indoctrinated in school by these neo-Marxists of the Frankfurt School and all their, you know, all their children. I mean, literally, they called, there were so many people from the Frankfurt School in California, they called it like the Rhine, the Pacific on the Rhine or something like that. Frankfurt on the Pacific, that's what they used to call it. And that's where, you know, Marcuse was in UCSD, Angela Davis, his student, went to UCLA. All these people were on the West Coast and UC Berkeley, and they were pushing these ideas. So already one generation was indoctrinated, the next generation was indoctrinated. In my generation, there was a fall of the Soviet Union. But the ideas were already penetrating the society. You already had someone like Howard Zinn writing socialist textbooks for kids, which are still being used for
Explain
years.
the phrase "by any means necessary," because I think
Oh,
we see a lot of
right.
that in the streets now.
By any means necessary was attributed to Sartre. We were talking about this. Later on, it started being used
Wrongly attributed to
to
Malcolm
Malcolm
X.
X. Malcolm X used it too. And the idea was that, you know, anything would justify the means would justify the end. So it doesn't make a difference what the means were. And that is very much connected to October 7th and using rape as resistance, that anything could be used and it would justify the ends. And again, this, I mean, even something so just atrocious as thinking rape as resistance is something that is connected in a way to Fanon again, because it's saying that, you know, part of any kind of violence against the colonialist oppressor would be to have this kind of catharsis against your delegitimization and your dehumanization. So therefore, if you dehumanize someone else and you go and commit violence against someone else, you kind of expunge that from yourself.
So there's a marriage here as well, because the Red Brigades of the 70s used violence.
Right.
In terms of, they were considered a terror group, but they would consider themselves a liberation group. And they really fit everything that you're speaking about.
Right.
Today, the terror groups of the Green part use the term jihad.
Right.
Jihad has a religious significance.
Right.
But jihad also includes the use of violence or any means necessary to attain going out in a holy war, typically is the most common.
Right.
So that seems to be a marriage also.
Right. There are many different parallels. I mean, in fact, I claim that there's about 10 or 15 different parallels in the way that they work on a day-to-day basis. I mean, you're talking about jihad. Jihad is an idea of constantly having to struggle to make the entire Dar al-Harb, the place of war, to be a place of Islam, and, you know, to expand Islam. And the same idea is the world revolution of communism. The idea was to expand communism all over the world. That was the idea of the Soviets. It was the idea of the Chinese, the idea of the Chinese People's War to go from the margins of society amongst the rural farmers and to bring that up into the urban. This is exactly what we see today. You see that Palestine was considered a margin of the third world, so to speak, and to bring it up to New York, to Columbia
So
University.
there's a convergence of interests right now.
There's a convergence of interest.
At what point does that convergence, at what point can that convergence diverge? And where is it possible that we will eventually see a break in this at some point? Right now, they work together, but at some point, I mean, there are conflicts.
The whole point in my paper was that the break was seen too late. It was too late once the Islamists took power and they purged thousands and thousands of communist Iranian Marxists, either killed them or kicked them out of the country. In Iran, in the Iranian Revolution, it was too late at that point.
So that's another question that I had. How was that tolerated? Brutal regime, that's not something that is usually something you see with human rights organizations. The terror, the torture, the hangings, the public hangings, when this was going on, wasn't there a point, or why wasn't there a point that the red part said, hold it?
They were already too weak at that point. That's really the answer, because there were many different student groups that were Marxists, and slowly but surely there were thousands and thousands of arrests, and the Islamists had more power, and they just brutally repressed everyone else. They did have a majority in order to get into power.
You wrote in your paper, there's one point you wrote, don't think that this means we think like you, that we're acting together with you. This is a temporary alliance or something.
They both, at the time, yes, the Iranian Marxists thought that that eventually Khomeini would eventually fail, he would fall. And they were wrong, obviously. And that's the whole, there's a big danger in that. Now, I think when we kind of try to apply this to the United States, I think this is why it seems a little bit far-fetched. It's a general idea that you might cause, if people in America allow this, and they allow this to normalize in the United States and think that these things are normal, and think that repression is normal and anything is excused in the name of Islamism. Sorry for people at the window. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're in the same situation as Iran, because they don't have, the Islamists have not taken power. But what's ends up happening in the United States is that it's subverting itself. There's a self-subversion. There's a cultural Maoism, Marxism that is kind of eating away at society and making it weak, that it can implode. I don't think that, I mean, with the just with the demography of the United States.
That's the protocol, isn't it? Isn't that?
That's part of the idea. That's how it attacks the United States. How it attacks us is literally having the Islamists come after us, which is.
I spoke to someone earlier about this, and what he told me was, this is really like a cult.
Yeah.
And we think of a cult of people that were brainwashed. There's an ideology they can't get out of it. Once you're in it, that's it. You're in it for life. We've seen the results of cult behavior. Does that make sense to you at all?
Absolutely makes sense to me, because I think that the Marxist principles, or the neo-Marxist / what's the CRT, all these, this whole kind of intersectional critical race theory. It's part of this whole intersectional kind of constellation of identity and this kind of victimhood, Olympics.
So explain that as well. I'm not so sure that everyone understands the. I mean, I refer to it as a prefix menu. That once you go into an ideology, you're given the menu in advance. These are the things that you.
Right. There's a certain ideology.
Intersectionality.
Intersectionality is something that is a word that started to be used by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who was actually she's a law professor, and she actually started referring to it as its intersectionality of different identities in context of certain legal cases. Let's say if you're a Black woman, you could be discriminated against as a Black person and as a woman, but sometimes those two things intersect. And as a Black woman, there was a case actually that she had that actually proved that.
So that's not exactly how it's
That's
used
not,
today.
but now it's kind of been expanded into something else. And that means that there's an intersectionality today of different marginalized peoples, different oppressed peoples, that they have to come together and have solidarity and intersect and all work together for one goal. And this is that the Palestinian cause has come into that intersectionality.
Explain how Jews, who have probably been one of the most victimized and oppressed people in history, don't fit in to the victim side of intersectionality, but fit in today to the oppressor side of intersectionality.
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, Jews are kind of like a sui generis, there's not really, Jews are an unusual case, let us say, okay? Because historically we've been oppressed in many places, but I think that this also shows the bias of these kind of movements, the woke movement, of all these intersectional movements, that they have a Western bias. They're only looking at it from the American perspective. Their whole obsession with race. I mean, I've talked to a lot of Africans and they think it's very funny. They just don't, because they don't have that issue in Africa. The color of your skin is not being, it's not an issue. There's tribal issues. They actually might understand our situation in the Middle East better because they actually have friends who are African who tell me that. But with intersectionality, it's coming from a very American perspective. So wherever an ethnic group is placed in the American or in the Western configuration is where they have their points. So if you're the most oppressed, you're going to be a Black, woman, lesbian, Muslim, that those are going to be the strongest, the places of most that are considered most oppressed. Because it's only coming, again, it's looking at it with the Western eyes. It's not looking at global history and how, in Africa, you could be oppressed as a Black person, in North Africa as a slave. You could be a white person that was taken to slavery, which did happen in Africa as well. So those are also oppressed peoples, but they're not looking at the European model or what's going on in Africa, or not what's going on in Asia. They're looking at it only from an American perspective.
It's also a nationalist element involved because the Jews are now part of a nationality that's commonly called Israel.
Right. No, it definitely has to do with Israel, but I think they also, besides that, they really make Jews the most white because they're privileged. That's all. They pass for white. They don't do anything that's particularly, a lot of Jews are not practicing in such a way that makes them very, very different from other Christians or other people that are the majority of the country. So they don't really look at it like that. Now, the fact that they happen to be aligned with Israel is not working for their Jews' advantage, because, again, because of the Saidism from Edward Said, from Orientalism, of looking at Zionism as a colonialist structure, then you are complicit in colonialism if you support Israel.
The Soviet Union originally take that stance?
They did.
When Israel was formed. At the beginning, the Soviet Union was the second country to
recognize Israel. It was the second country, but as soon as that was because of the doctor's plot. It was because Golda Meir went there and tried to get people to immigrate, and they wouldn't let us. So then they turned against. Also, it was more, it was worthwhile for them to align themselves with the Arabs, just on an economic level. So that's why they dropped us like a hot potato. They thought that they would have a kindred spirits. We're also socialists. We're also, a lot of us, our leaders were Russian. Ben Gurion was originally Russian. So there's a lot of that, but they dropped us pretty fast.
So here's the logical question in this very illogical paradigm that you have here. The logical thing would be that the non-communist West, France, Germany, the United States, Britain, would nominally, you would expect them to be supporting Jewish nationalism against this threat that you see on the other side. Yet they claim they support Israel's right to self-defense, etc., but they also support the right of Palestinians to have an independent Palestinian state, which is in the interest of the Soviet Union, of Russia, of Russia, China, Iran. It's in the interest of every enemy of the West. What is it that they don't see? or they
It's
see
not,
and
I
ignore?
don't think it's a matter of what they don't see. I think that they have a lot of interest in the Middle East. I think that this entire conflict would look very different to the West if there was no oil here. If we just drained all the oil, sucked all the oil out of the entire Middle East,
That's getting to be less and less of an issue, isn't it?
well, it's still an issue. It's still somewhat of an issue. And we still, you know, Iran is still open now. Um, that would be, you know, things would be a little, maybe a little bit different. But the way that they see it right now is, I think that they have a few things. First of all, if you're talking about Europe, they do have a huge part of the population in certain countries that are Muslims. They have to think about their populace, and they have to think about street protests. They have to think about their
Is it lip
votes.
service or is it real? Because if it's lip service,
It
you know,
might be, it
fine.
might be real if you
If
want to
it's
talk.
real, if
If
it's
they
real,
also
they're
have an
really
issue,
undermining themselves.
they have an issue of colonial guilt, which is we all know about that. There's a whole, I mean, this along with talk about CRT, we talk about reparations in America, the whole Ibram X Kendi, Robin DiAngelo kind of mentality there, the racism. If you're not anti-racist, you're a racist. That's American. But when you look at something like France or something like England or ex-colonialist countries, they're going to look at it, you know, we owe the Arabs, and you know, we caused problems there with our interventions, and they have a whole different kind of relation. They also have a different relation to anti-Semitism because of the Holocaust. So they have, on one hand, they feel obliged in some ways to Israel. On the other hand, they have a large Muslim populace that they have to deal with, and some of the Muslim populace there is moderate, but they also have a lot of extremists, and they have people that are pushing them. And America has a whole different kind of demographics, so they have to deal with different issues. But I think that the ideology there has really permeated the you know, the left, the West. The think people that used to be moderate leftists are being pushed and pushed, and now you can see that now with AOC being pushed by Nurdin Kiswani, the head of within our lifetime, who's the most extreme leftist activist in the United States right now for the Palestinians. And you know, she's telling her that she's a liberal. This is like a curse.
So here's a question.
She's one of those progressive
Question I wanted to
Congress
ask you.
Yeah.
There's a difference between progressive and liberal.
Yes.
And I have another friend that told me that progressives are giving liberals a bad name.
Yes. Well, you
And
could say that.
if you're going to be a liberal, everything that we see is the
Right.
most illiberal things that could possibly happen. Yet many liberals are now being caught under the rubric of the progressive push. And spend a minute or two talking.
Right. Well, first of all, people have to understand, first and foremost, that progressive, the word progressive is a Soviet term. It is a communist term. What are we progressing towards? What are we progressing towards? Everything, this is another point that I think also with the Red Green Alliance, we're talking about eschatology. We're talking about what's going to be in the future. What are we progressing toward? For them, it's progressing towards a communist utopia. And to be progressive back in the day, back in the 50s and 60s, was to be on the side of the Soviet Union. And that was to be progressing towards world communism. That's where the word progressive comes from in the modern sense. There was also the progressives in the 1920s, but that's really where it started. I mean, in America,
Well, it's not very different today. I mean, that's really what
what
they're talking about today.
That's what it means. So, but liberal just means that you laissez-faire, let people do whatever they want, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. It's very utilitarian. It's not the same thing as progressive. So those are two different things. So you have someone like, let's say, Bill Maher, calls himself, he's a liberal, he's a classic liberal. There's like Dershowitz considers himself a classic. Many people consider themselves to be classic liberals, the main line of the Democratic Party. But when you have the progressives saying, well, it's not good enough. What you're doing is not active enough. You need to be more active. You need to do something about the social problems. So they push it further and further left. And sometimes, you know, they push it so far left that it kind of, you know, falls off the political map into radicalism, into, you know, real radicalism, which is it's not the first time it's happened in American society. We had the Weather Underground, and you had the Black Panthers in the 1960s. And, you know, you have here in Israel to some extent, every liberal country.
When you talk about the campus issue, which you
Right.
talked about in the paper, it took root among the faculty.
Right.
And
you mean the faculty were at Iran, or you mean
yes,
everywhere?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but even in the States,
right,
the faculty really lean left and lean progressive. They've always been that way. At least they've always been liberal, but now they've gone, as you said, off the cliff, where a lot of liberals don't want to be.
I don't think,
don't wanna
I think
go.
that the seeds have been planted already. We're talking here, if we're talking about post-colonialism and we're talking about Marcuse, these things have been in the air
Well-
for 30 or 40 years. They were already in college at the time, but especially in the social sciences where these things dominate, they've already been very dominant. I think the students just gave them license to do that. Since some of these students were out there doing it, they could say, I'm supporting my students by going out there and sitting
We
with them
saw
in
that now
cameras.
as well.
Right. So that's what it is. Just gave them license to say what they were thinking, to live what they're believing. They feel, you know, the Marxist word is praxis, to practice what you preach, to practice what you're doing, and to actually to be an activist.
So what's the plan of moving it from the ivory tower outside the walls of the campus into mainstream
Right.
society?
This is like something that,
What's
you
the
know,
plan?
Ayaan Hirsi Ali just wrote this very long essay, which is an excellent essay about subversion. And that was, he quotes Yuri Bezmenov, the Soviet dissident, that he talks about a cultural Marxism process that takes 20, 30, 40 years, depending on what it is. It could be 5 years, it could be 3 years until you get to the revolution. And that is just basically brainwashing. I mean, using the word brainwashing is a Chinese Maoist term. It's actually, you know, so to brainwash the children, to get them, the kids to be, you know, indoctrinated. I mean, just college is where you get you indoctrinated. I think it's very funny that people are surprised that it's happening. We're surprised that it was happening on campus, because that's exactly where they're getting indoctrinated. They weren't getting indoctrinated in third grade. Now they probably are because of CRT or something, but at the time they weren't. And now that's where that's the center of where all the indoctrination happens. So this is a process. And what has excused, I think, to go back to what we were just saying, what has excused all this kind of behavior is again, is the postmodernism, is deconstructing the language, Derrida, deconstruction of language, and just to take something
No
like
truth,
no
only
truth, who's a
relative truth.
terrorist? Well, who's to say you're a terrorist? The Israelis, the IOF, the Israeli occupation forces are terrorists, not Hamas that's beheading babies and killing people and raping people. So that's part of it. So that's the postmodernism together with the neo-Marxism, and then you have the victimology. So the Muslims are seen as the unfortunate brown people that are being oppressed by the white people. Now you place the Jews in the white category, so obviously Israel is the bad guy, and that's how you do it. But I mean, all of this, if you look at the entire thing together, it's like it's a Soviet active measure. It's a psyop that has been, you know, been taking place slowly but surely, part of a cultural change in America over the past 20 or 30 or 40 years.
How much of this works back into the green societies? For example, one of the photos that you have in your article is a mural of Gandhi, Mandela, and Martin Luther King. Now, I've seen them used as symbols within the red-green stuff that you see in the West. I haven't seen that much of that.
It's it's almost
within the South.
non-existent. This is for show. I mean, when you have Ismail Haniyeh standing in front of a huge poster in 2018, the Great March of Return, a picture of Gandhi and Nelson Mandela and MLK.
Does the average Palestinian know who these people are?
They might have heard of them. You know, they read history just like everyone else does, and they interpret it in their own way. I'm not going to discount that, because people do tend to see heroes from other cultures. If they can relate to them, they interpret it in their own way. You have to remember that Che Guevara was once in Gaza. He once visited Gaza with Nasser in the 50s when they were still in charge of it. And so this is, they do feel that they're part of a revolutionary movement in a lot of ways, but it's their interpretation. It is not the Western interpretation. They see it, and then this is the way they relate to the West. Just like if you talk to a friend, or you had a friend coming from another country, you would talk to them in a way that they would understand you. That's the way they talk to the West. And you can't, I mean, I wouldn't even say it's like, it is propaganda. It is, it's a way of communicating with people of different cultures, but it is also in some ways maybe genuine. They feel that
so
way.
The mural
Yeah,
that you're referring to,
but that's a psyop. I mean, that's something that
right,
that's for show.
That's meant to influence the West.
Right.
What is it that people could do who want to deconstruct that? What is it that they would show the West that reflects part of the green society, that they would take a step back and say, whoa, this is not what we signed up for?
I mean, if you want to talk about MLK, you know, you could talk about the Alabi quarter of Gaza, you know, that they have people there that are living, you know, that they have the way that they still have racism in Palestinian societies. So I mean, every single one of these things can be deconstructed.
Why isn't it?
They do. People do try, but I think there was a clip today. There's many clips today. People interviewing students on campus, and they tell them these things. So a gay guy was actually asking, a gay Jewish guy was asking a bunch of people in a Pride kind of event on campus someplace, and he was telling them how they treat people, they treat gay people in Hamas treats them, and the girl just started going crazy. She started jumping up and down and said, "I don't want to hear this." Because it doesn't compute. It doesn't compute in their system. It doesn't work into the framework of their intersectional solidarity that people, I mean, basically that message has to be put out
Truth of
constantly.
value within this?
For the Red Green Alliance, or for us? For us, it has to be. It's the only way that we can fight it. I think George Kennan said, the anti-communist, he said that's the only way you can fight Soviet propaganda, Maoist propaganda, is with the truth. That's just to expose what really is. And I think that people are having a hard time with
That
that.
doesn't seem to have been working out very well, does it? So,
Well, the Jews are always trying to pursue the truth, right? And Gemara, banging it out is all about the truth.
well,
So we have to try our best, no?
there's a saying, I hope I'm doing it justice, beware or look up the people who seek the truth, beware of those that say they found it. So, I think it's something we have to look at. But when you have all these competing ideologies that are thrown in, but the bottom line of the ideologies have some sort of common denominator, that's what's moving it and keeping it forward. But in terms of the intellectual West, in terms of a campus, if I were a campus president, or if you were able to speak to a campus president who was sincere in seeing, all right, this took 20 years, what do we do to get some sort of balance in here? What is it that needs to be done?
Well, I totally, it's a great question. And I think that the curriculum needs to be changed. If the professors need to be changed to get the curriculum to be changed, that also needs to be done. There's nothing, I mean, I studied Marxism under a Marxist, professor, and he was well known, and he probably taught Patrice Cullors from UCLA also. She said she was a trained Marxist. I don't know if the same Marxist trained her as trained me, but he was a declared Marxist, but he was an open-minded person. He was a good person. He exposed us to different things. Now, I'd like to see something being taught about post-colonialism of Edward Said, and also teaching his critics. Let's see his critics being quoted. Let's see that in the syllabus. Let's see people reading Edward Said's critics as well as reading him. If you're going to teach one side of it, if you're going to teach the Marxists, teach the anti-communists. Let them see both texts and let them judge for themselves. That's what liberal education is about. That's what education is about. It's about thinking for yourself.
That's not progressive education.
That's not progressive education.
It's not cancel culture.
It's called liberal education. So we need to go back to that. We need to go back. I think there's a movement in the United States to go back to that kind of journalism, to go back to that kind of academia, and or maybe not go back and go a step further and just really kind of look at values. I think that a lot of this we see girls with purple hair, doing Islamic prayer, and these people are atheists. You see, people are looking for some kind of identity. They're looking for some kind of belonging. They admire something about Islam, which could be nice. You can admire something about Islam, but you shouldn't admire Islamic extremism. You shouldn't justify the rape and torture of people.
There's a difference between Islam and Islamism.
Islamism, right? And that needs to be emphasized. I think the Abrahamic, the Abrahamic things that we have in common should be emphasized. We should try to encourage that. Those are good. Those are positive things. But it shouldn't come from a place of extremism. That's what the university should be. That's the spirit of what should be happening.
I think your piece, and I hope we see some more pieces like that following up on it. It's the beginning of trying to get us to wrap our head around some of the craziness that I think a lot of people feel is going on, and not understanding what's happening. And I think that is sort of like a social commentary that really helped us do it. And we need to see more of that stuff.
Yes.
And I hope our viewers really got a peek into it, a little bit of what's behind this stuff. it's kind of, it's intellectual and academic, but.
Right, but
we
I
see-
think
we
it's
see
so
the pro-
important,
we
it's
see
so
the
important not
practice.
to ignore the ideology. This is a big mistake that people do.
It's all in the
People,
ideology.
people must look at how people think. In order to understand how
That's-
people behave, you must understand how they
That's
think.
the motor of the brain, it's the
Exactly.
ideology, so we'll take
Exactly.
it from there. So thank you, Tirza.
Okay, thank you,
Thank you,
Irwin.
all of you, for listening in, and we hope to be back next week with more research. And back for another edition of the JCPA, soon to be JCFA War Room. Have a great day.